Welcome to our viewers. Thank you for joining us today for our symposium on inequalities and the increased risk of political violence. My name is Hoda Mahmoudi. I'm the holder of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace. We are located at the University of Maryland in College Park. Today's lecture is co-sponsored by the Anti-Black Racism Initiative in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, by the Critical Race Initiative in the Department of Sociology, and by the Department of African American Studies. I would like to thank Dr. Kate Seaman, who is the Assistant Director at the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace, for all of her work in organizing this event today. And it's my pleasure to extend a warm welcome to our speaker. There are three of them, but this morning I will introduce our first speaker, and that will be done in just a few minutes. But first I have to go over some technical stuff. And that is that when you join this virtual meeting, you are muted and your your video is off. This program is being recorded, and by participating in this virtual meeting, you acknowledge and consent to your image, likeness, and voice possibly being recorded. You will have the opportunity to submit questions at the end of the talk by using the Q&A function, and that is at the bottom of your screen. So a little bit in introducing today's important symposium. The realities of the pandemic in 2020 have highlighted the underlying structural causes of inequality, both in the US and throughout and across the globe. The clear differences between those who can stay at home and stay safe and those who cannot highlights the corrosive effects of inequalities. Throughout 2020, we witnessed an increase in political instability with growing polarization over social issues and public health protection measures. This civil unrest highlights the fragility of our current social system and demonstrates the consequences of growing economic inequality. The question remains, now that the impact and consequences of these inequalities have been exposed, will the pandemic be a catalyst for change? This symposium will explore the underlying inequalities in our social systems, discuss potential solutions, and examine the extent to which these structural faults could lead to a growth in political violence and disorder. And to start us off on this very important topic is our first speaker, Professor Anke Hoeffler, who is Professor of Development Research, Department of Politics and Public Administration at the University of Constance in Germany. Dr. Hoeffler's research is in the areas of development and security. She is a widely cited social scientist and received an Alexander von Humboldt Professorship, which is Germany's highest award for international research. In February 2019, she left the University of Oxford and moved to the University of Constance in Germany, where she has a chair in the development policy in the Department of Politics and Public Administration. Professor Hoeffler holds a Doctor of Philosophy in Economics from the University of Oxford. Her research interests are wide-ranging and interdisciplinary. Broadly, she is interested in the social causes of excess morbidity and mortality and uses mainly quantitative methods in her academic quest. Her current research projects focus on the impact of interpersonal violence on development, in particular, violence against children and women, She also is exploring the relationship between interpersonal and political violence, as well as the cost of violence, all very pertinent and relative topics to our understanding the problem of inequalities today. The title of her talk is "What are the Global Costs of Violence?" Please welcome Dr. Hoeffler.
Thank you very much, Professor Mahmoudi, for this invitation and for the opportunity to present my work to you. Let me share my screen for my presentation. I hope this is going to work. Okay. Great. So I hope you can see what I can see. So I'm going to talk about the global cost of violence. And so this is based on joint work with James Fearon, who's a professor of political science at the University of Stanford. And this is a big question, so we're going to break it down into a series of questions. So what are the different types of violence is the first question I'd like to address with you today. And then who are the victims? Where does violence take place? How can violence be costed? I'm aware that many of you, I'm by training an economist, might not be interested in putting dollar values to it, but maybe I can convince you that this might be a useful exercise in its own right. What are these cost estimates that we've come up so far? And then maybe most importantly, can violence be reduced? So I don't need to tell this audience that civil wars are the most prevalent form of large-scale armed conflict in the world today, and they kill and displace a lot of people. Most of the people who are being displaced today are displaced because of armed conflict. So how many people are being killed or have been killed in civil wars across the world? So since the end of the Cold War till today, so this is on the horizontal axis here, and so you see it goes up and down a little bit. These bars show you how many people were killed in armed conflict. The different colors give you the type of conflict. So the dark blue ones are basically what you would consider civil war. And the data all come from a Swedish university, which is sort of world leading in providing data on armed conflict. So it's the Uppsala Conflict Data Program. Okay, so these are people who are being killed as a direct consequence of the use of violence. But you'll say, hang on, this is not all the people that are being killed in these sort of types of wars. There's a lot of people who can't get medical care and who have hunger, malnutrition, and die of lack of food. And so last year there was a British Medical Council medicine article where these researchers estimated that for each person killed in combat, so these are civilians or military personnel, the people we're looking at in this graph, for each one of those, we've got another 1.8 people killed because of lack of nutrition and medical care. So basically for each person killed in these wars, you've got extra, almost another 2 extra deaths, indirect deaths. So very often in social science, we disagree about a lot of things. That's how science evolves. We contradict each other and then sort of drive the knowledge frontier forward. But we do agree on one thing: war is development in reverse. It is really bad for a country and their people to experience a large-scale conflict. But is violence the only so is violence equal to war? Is war the only type of violence that I want to discuss today? No. This is a picture of London where somebody was stabbed to death. This is from Mexico, from a drug siege. So you can see a seizure. You can see money and weapons and drugs here. This is an image of domestic violence and another one of domestic violence. So this collective violence that I started off with, the wars, are of course devastating, but they're not the only type. And once you start thinking about it, it's actually quite rare. Most countries are at peace. But homicide and assault occur in all countries. And I'm going to talk about this interpersonal violence now, where the individual or small groups without an overt political aim are the perpetrators. So maybe to make it a little bit clearer in a categorization here to the left-hand side, I sort of list what we understand by collective violence. We have international wars, so between two countries, very rare these days. Internal armed conflicts, so these civil wars, one-sided violence, which was also part of this first graph I showed you. So this is one group or a state killing off people from another group, or the civilians, a state killing civilians. And then non-state violence, these are sort of groups within a country that sort of attack and kill each other. So for example, Muslims and Hindus in India would be one example. So the state doesn't get involved per se. Interpersonal violence is what I would like to sort of focus on now. So we have homicide here, physical assault, sexual assault and rape. IP, so intimate partner violence, I want to talk about separately. And then there's, of course, violence against children, for which I have data and we'll talk about, but there's also likely to be considerable violence against the elderly and the disabled, but I haven't got worldwide data that I can compare. But data from the United States, where we've got typically good information, we know that this is a considerable problem. Notice that I haven't mentioned terrorism here as collective violence. Terrorism is very difficult to define, and it sort of comes under sort of one-sided violence, or sometimes also non-state violence. So I didn't use the word terrorism because of these definitional issues, but of course the sort of people who are being killed, what typically is referred to as terrorism, are included in the numbers I'm going to show you. So then, of course, a lot of people are killed because of self-harm. So more people die internationally because of suicide than of collective or interpersonal violence. But I'm going to park this and sort of not talk about self-harm any more today. But it's of course clear to us that these different forms of violence, collective, so once men, for example, have been to war, they're more likely to mistreat their families, and these mistreated families members have then more suicidal thoughts. We know all of this, and it's a very intuitive sort of connection, but in research, we still have these silos where we sort of look at either collective violence, interpersonal violence, so the sort of criminologists, for example, and then self-harm, which is very much a sort of psychologist's field. Let's have a look at some data. So what are the homicide rates and counts? So rates is per 100,000. So the pandemic has made this a lot easier to talk about. These sort of different rates. We're much more used to thinking in per 100,000, cases per 100,000. Now, the most recent year for which we have got very good data coverage is 2015. And I've looked up here from the World Health Organization the countries with the highest ratio. So El Salvador, Honduras, Venezuela, Jamaica. So you see there's a lot of Latin American and Caribbean countries here, but also South Africa, and DRC is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is the last one in this sad list. Okay, so maybe just as a comparison, where does the US stand? So the US has basically got, if you want to round here, 5 per 100,000. This was in 2015. So over time, you probably know this, the US homicide rates have gone down from the early 90s until recently. There's been a downward trend, and in the last 2 years, 3 years, there's been an uptick on homicide rates in the United States. Germany's basically got less than 1 per 100,000. So the US, if you want to express it like this, is 5 times as violent when it comes to homicide than Germany. Maybe another comparison, if you look at the numbers, so the counts, how many people are being killed. So in Brazil, in 1 year, this is 2015, there were over 55,000 Brazilians who were killed. And if you compare this to the Syrian civil war, and that was a particularly bad year for the Syrian civil war, in the civil war in Syria, 45,000 people were killed. Yeah. Now, Syria makes headlines. The homicide rates in Brazil do not. Yeah, so this is this adds to our perception that collective violence is really bad and something we should be or should do something about, and not this interpersonal violence. So in numbers, from the World Health Organization, so collective violence per year is about 150,000. And interpersonal violence is a little bit, it's 480,000, almost 500,000. So when I say thereabouts, so there are many borderline cases. So for example, in the US and in Latin American countries, there's a lot of talk about gang violence. So is a gang interpersonal violence? Typically it is counted as interpersonal violence because there are no political motives there cited typically, but maybe they have their origin in something that some of you might call structural poverty. There are gray areas. And so keep this in mind. But no matter how you sort of where you draw the borderlines, which dead bodies you count for to collective or interpersonal violence, what I want to show in this graph is that so many more people are killed in homicides rather than in wars. So the types of violence, we've got interpersonal and collective. Who are the victims here? So the first bar on the top is collective violence, so the wars. Then comes interpersonal violence, and then here I have just as a point of comparison, put self-harm. And you can sort of see the 50% is pretty much in the middle here of the, and the blue bars are much longer. So many more men are killed in wars, in interpersonal violence, and also more men than women kill themselves. Okay. So what are these patterns of deadly violence? 3/4 of the victims are male. So homicide is squarely a male problem. It's mostly a problem of young men under the age of 30. And it is now a leading cause of death in young men in some Latin American countries. Yeah. So many deaths are related to the illegal drugs trade. And I'm happy to sort of take more questions on this in the Q&A and on any topic that might interest you and that you would like to ask me on. So what about female homicide victims? I said homicide is a male issue, but of course women are also being killed. Here the patterns are very different. Yeah, they're less likely to be killed, but unlike men, they're less likely to be killed by strangers. Globally, public health experts estimate that 40% of all female victims are killed by a current or former intimate partner. Yeah, so intimate partners are boyfriends or husbands. So the most, statistically speaking, the most dangerous person in a woman's life is her partner. So where does this violence take place? Well, so I already talked about the danger from partners and with fatal violence. What about non-fatal violence against women? Most of the violence against women happens in the home. I mean, women get harassed and have aggressive behavior directed to them in the community, at work, on public transport and so on. But we estimate, and that's based on a lot of expert advice, that most of the violence happens in the home. And so how do we know this? This knowledge comes from surveys, so from victimization surveys where women are asked in private, confidentially, has this happened to you? So have you been punched, pulled, kicked, and so on? So it's an act-based survey. Has this happened to you in the last year, and who did this to you? And this is a great gift from the US aid to all social scientists. There's the demographic and health surveys, DHS surveys, which you can now sort of download on their website and pull together a lot of data for a lot of people around the globe. And these are these sort of surveys, demographic and health surveys, DHS. And about 12% of women state in surveys, globally, that they suffered intimate partner violence during the past year. So this can be physical or sexual violence. Now, where does this happen? I said in the home, but where in terms of location? In high-income countries, this rate is relatively low. And then you can sort of see the different bars going up. The highest is for Sub-Saharan Africa, where 28% of women say that their intimate partner violated them in the last year. So this is also the poorest region in the world. Other poor regions, Middle East and North Africa and South Asia, also have very high rates. So what about non-lethal violence against children? Now, violence against children can, again, happen everywhere in schools. So, for example, a lot of children are being hit in school or in the community. Quite a big number of children are in prisons. They work globally. They are in orphanages and other institutions and are being abused there. But most of the violence takes place at home. So the place that children should feel the safest in is the most dangerous, statistically speaking. Now, how much violence do they experience in the home? These are, of course, only estimates. So how do we know about what goes on in the home? It's sort of hidden in plain sight. So here, in the multiple indicator cluster surveys, these MICs, there's a module where primary caregivers, these are sort of very abstract sort of terms, but mothers mainly are being asked, your child did something wrong in the last month. How did you react? And you can sort of say, I ignored the unwanted behavior, or I took privileges away, or I grounded my child, or and then again, act-based, I slapped my child with a bare hand on the buttocks, I did, and so on, up to very severe physical punishment, taking an implement like a belt or cane and hit my child several times. And so this is self-reported evidence that we pieced together from these different mixed surveys. Here I've done it by income, not by world region. If I did it by world region, then Sub-Saharan Africa would be very high yet again. Now you might sort of say, okay, many Swedish parents would have problems admitting to any of this physical punishment, and so their self-report would be underreporting violence against their children, whereas maybe a Kenyan parent would sort of say, you spare the rod, you spoil the child. So they might even over-report. So, but it's the best evidence we have of something that happens behind closed doors. And again, it should be obvious from this graph that even if it's measured with big margins of error, the higher income countries have got less of this type of violence than poor income countries, low income countries, sorry. So the types of violence, who are the victims, where does violence take place, how can violence be costed? So I'm aware that not everybody in the audience might be interested in this, but if you were asked how can I sort of come up with a total cost estimate, I would have to take the numbers of cases and multiply it by the cost per case, so by the unit cost. Yeah. And then, of course, there's some economic costs. So when I have a war, it's not just people who are being killed and injured, and there's a cost to it, but also the economy is in ruins. And this is what economists have been pretty good at, trying to sort of get estimates for these economic costs. In criminology, people have been very good to sort of look at the number of cases and some unit cost, but they haven't been very good about the economic cost. So think of Brazil, I sort of showed earlier on. So if you were to invest some of your money, would you invest it in an area where there's a lot of homicide in a Brazilian part of a Brazilian town? No, of course you wouldn't. So less legal economic activity is taking place in highly violent places, and crowd is being crowded out. But we're not very good estimating these economic costs. Or you might also want to think about them as externalities, if this is a terminology that you're more used to. So what I've done so far really has been, I've been talking about the number of cases here. What's the prevalence? Yeah. And what sort of numbers do we have here? The UN Office of Drugs and Crime, UNODC, and the World Health Organization give us numbers on cases on homicide and assault. The World Health Organization, and then some other organizations, as I showed you, from the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, and then there's also the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. They collect a lot of data on how many people are being killed in collective violence. And then we have this survey evidence. Yeah, I mentioned the DHS and the demographic health surveys and the multiple indicator cluster surveys where victims are being asked. So for example, we think that the UNODC data on assault are basically unusable because these are data that are being reported by the police forces in each country. And some have got good statistics and some have poor statistics, and some report well and some others don't report very well and reliably. But there's other survey evidence, for example, from Gallup, that one can use. And so each dead or injured person, how do we cost this life or injury? I'll talk about this a little bit more on the next slide. We use a concept that's called the, sorry, there's a typo, value of a statistical life. And then what about the economic cost? So here we use a counterfactual. So what would the economy have been if the war hadn't taken place? And that's, of course, a sort of big, sort of if, what if statements. And we're using some statistical methods. It's a synthetic control method. Some of you might be familiar with this already, but it's basically to sort of say, if this country hadn't had this war, it would have maybe grown like similar countries. So we construct a synthetic country. So like maybe all the neighboring countries, it would have been just like those countries, or countries with a similar income or similar age structure and so on. And then we come up with a counterfactual and calculate the difference between the actual drop in GDP because of the war, the economy shrinks, and the counterfactual where the country would have been. But of course, there are other economic costs that you could in principle measure. And they have been measured in countries like the United States, Australia, the United Kingdom. So costs of apprehension in correcting offenders, medical cost, and then additional security. You might want to hire more police officers, or privately you might want to have a security camera, or you want to hire a company, in a private security company, for example, in South Africa. If you've ever been in South Africa, it's very common that compounds are being patrolled by private security. And then, of course, you have lost income. If somebody gets killed or if somebody's injured, you have lost income, which in principle you could sort of add up. And then I was talking about this reduced legal activity already because of the high levels of violence. So in principle, these can be costed, but it is very difficult to do this globally. So what is this value of a statistical life measure? Yeah. Many of you will say, but surely a life is invaluable. How can you put a price on a life? And what about the statistical life? What is the statistical life? Well, it goes back to Thomas Schelling, the whole concept. Because he said, let's not talk about a particular life, because if I asked you how much should we pay to save this little girl's life, it might be a completely different answer to a little boy's, or a grown man, or an old man, or an old woman, or a person in your neighborhood, or your parent, or you see the point. So you would put a different value potentially on different lives. Say here we talk about a statistical life. How are these being calculated? So think of a dangerous job that's being offered to you, let's say on an oil rig, and you want to have $10 extra per hour to accept this work contract, because you know that there is a 1 in 1 million risk of dying on this oil platform. And so, of course, $10 for a risk of 1 in 1 million is equivalent to a 10 million certain death. Yeah, and so the value of a statistical life with these parameters of a risk premium and the risk of dying would be 10 million. So a one life would be $10 million. As I already hinted, labor markets do actually provide this implicit information on trade-off between life and health. And Kip Viscusi, an American economist who's sort of done a lot of calculations on using these sort of labor market data. Alternatively, you could just sort of say, what's your willingness to pay? Yeah, also called contingent valuation. How much would you be willing to pay not to have to endure this risk? You will find that any contingent valuations come up with much higher numbers than these sort of implicit informations in the labor market, because people overestimate the risk that they are facing, and they also always state a very high willingness to pay. And then in public health, you get these disability adjusted life years, where death is 1 and perfect health is 0, and anything in between is sort of adjusted life, and we're not using this concept here, mainly because it's a very good concept in public health, but it's very unclear how to put dollar values to it. You know, should you use then for 1 disability adjusted life year, should you use 1 times average income, 3 times, 5 or 8? I mean, these are the sort of typical numbers that people publish, but there's no direct connection with the willingness to pay. So you can think of the value of a statistical life of how much is society prepared to spend to avoid a death or an injury. So how do I price injuries, rape or sexual assault? I know it's not the same thing, but typically in the literature, we have both together. This is sort of based on information that we've got available from criminologists, and they sort of think that about 3% of the value of a life is the price we should put on rape and sexual assault, and on physical assault 1.2%. So what sort of cost estimates do we come up with? So what would you have asked yourself was particularly costly? Well, so all the blue-ish colors here have something to do with interpersonal violence. The collective violence, the stuff that makes the headlines, in our estimates, again, they're big error bands around all of these sort of estimates. So the collective violence is war. Yeah. War and what some of you might want to call terrorism. These kill people, injure people, and you've got these economic costs. And then all of the rest has to do with homicide and assault, which happens in every country, and then non-fatal child abuse and intimate partner assault. We sort of think that this is similar to 11% of world GDP. So we would be willing to spend quite a lot of money to reduce this violence. So how can this violence be reduced? Maybe I'm a bit, I'm seeing this too optimistically, but I think we've made great medical progress. So just think of how quickly the vaccinations for COVID-19 came along, how we've dealt with Ebola. Polio is almost eradicated, and smallpox and rinderpest is actually eradicated. So if you go back and sort of look at the WHO discussions on the campaign on smallpox eradication in the 1950s, you can sort of see that a lot of people said, you know, it can't be done. You can't get on top of this problem. But as an international community, we sort of said, no, we do want to get on top of this, and we will, and we did. And so because we're making so much medical progress on these communicable diseases, the social causes of augmented morbidity and mortality become more important. Yeah, so that medically we can get some deaths down, and the social causes, so from violence, for example, are relatively speaking becoming more important. But of course, there's no vaccine against violence. And do we just have to accept violence as part of the human condition? It's not too long ago that we didn't even talk about this in international settings. So, for example, when the UN Millennium Development Goals were announced in 2000, there wasn't a single goal to do with violence. Then fast forward 15 years, the Sustainable Development Goals now have Sustainable Development Goal 16. Oh, now you get the German the German translation here. But anyhow, so the SDG, so Sustainable Development Goal 16, is the promotion of peaceful and inclusive societies, and it's got specific targets. So one is significantly reduce all forms of violence. Yeah. And 16.2 is end all forms of violence against children. So in the MDGs, we didn't have a single zero target. Yeah, because we didn't think that we could really eradicate certain ills that the MDGs were supposed to address. 15 years later, we've been a lot braver and sort of said zero hunger. We want to have zero hunger, and also on violence, all forms of violence against children should be eradicated by 2030. Yeah. So let me think a little bit about the consequences of everyday violence against children. So let's say a woman has a baby. This child is being receives corporal punishment in the family, might also witness intimate partner violence between her parents. In school, she receives punishment from the teacher, and then she's much more likely to drop out. We know that violence in school is one of the main reasons why children drop out of school. She leaves with not a lot of years of education. She's more likely to enter early inappropriate sexual relationships, makes her very vulnerable to unwanted pregnancy, STDs, AIDS, HIV in many parts of the world, and she's at much higher risk of experiencing violence in her relationship, and she's also much more likely to mistreat her children, and so the cycle continues. And so my current work is sort of trying to turn these considerations that are put forward into a book with Jim Fiorum. So that's part of my work, and the other part of my work is to sort of really think about how violence can be reduced, and in a much more practical, applied sense. So this is interdisciplinary work, a lot with psychologists. And a colleague of mine has developed so he's called Tobias Hecker, and he's developed a training module for teachers. Yeah, because many teachers worldwide, even though it's banned in a lot of countries, use violence in the classroom. And they do this for two reasons. They tell us to maintain discipline. Yes, sure, they've got very challenging classroom situations. Very often these class sizes are very big, but they don't realize what detrimental consequences this can have in the longer term, even if you instill discipline now. And then they sort of say they're not going to be able to learn if I don't beat them. Yeah, so there's a fundamental misunderstanding about learning and child development. And so this training module, it's abbreviated here as ICCT, so it's interaction competencies with children. So we wanted to strengthen interaction competencies with children for teachers, T. This is a 5-day teacher training program where they have to sort of reflect on their own experiences as a child of violence within schools and how they use violence in the classroom, and then they learn about something more specific about child development and how you can address challenging behavior in the classroom without resorting to violence. So we've got this evidence from Tanzania and Uganda. This is published work. These are cluster randomized controlled trials where we cluster at the level of the schools, and we've taken this to the poorest country in the Northern Hemisphere, to Haiti. And we've just finished the feasibility study, and then the president was assassinated, and there was an earthquake, and our Haitian partners are really resilient. They want to implement this, and we're in the process of training the enumerators, and the baseline is going to be started next in 2 weeks' time. Sorry about that. But my time is also nearly up. I wanted to sort of tell you that it's not only beating that happens in school, but a lot of degrading treatment. So we've had this picture made from a photograph that was just taken last year in a Haitian school, where this girl had to kneel on gravel as a punishment, and the others had to look on but weren't allowed to help her. Teachers said it's very encouraging in Haiti. Teachers and head teachers are very keen to introduce change. They've been very keen to attend our training program. 5 days is short if you really want to change something, but it is, of course, a lot of time that you're not in paid employment. In general, we have good evidence that programs can be effective. Parenting programs, I've got a parenting program running in Kenya with very poor parents, but similarly, they're very keen to learn and change. They're not expensive to implement. They are cost effective and have very high benefit cost ratios. Yeah, so I know what the costs of violence are, and I know how expensive or inexpensive these programs are, and I can tell you they are very, they have got very high returns. And so my number crunching should help to convince policymakers to implement these programs. Now, to conclude, war and homicide are, of course, very detrimental to the individual and to society at large. There are many ongoing efforts to reduce these types of violence. There is much less awareness of the damage that everyday violence can cause. So the everyday violence within partnerships against children in the home and in schools, that's what I mean by everyday violence. The sort of stuff that most people never talk about. It's just sort of something that you have to endure as a woman, for example, is a very commonly held belief. And so please, this is my big message here. Let's all join together and make the world a better place by reducing violence truly in all its forms. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Hoeffler, for that very informative presentation. You have given us so much to think about, especially what I take away from your very helpful lecture is this area of interpersonal violence, how really that is where humanity, if you will, is at war in a much more significant manner than in the wars, which we don't, of course, condone wars, but it seems these interpersonal wars are so profoundly disturbing and so much a part of our society, and I think it's very important for us to think about, as you said, how do we begin to address this in more effective ways, and it seems that even the larger organizations, like the United Nations, although they are paying attention, the interventions don't seem to be so far very effective. Anyway, thank you very much for that lecture. Now is the time for our audience to please ask your questions by going to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we will read off each question as they are asked. First of all, I want to, let's see, Kate, do you have a question?
I do actually. Thank you, Hoda. I think one of the things I found interesting was the way you described the silos in academia between the different approaches to violence. So you mentioned psychology, criminology, sociology, and I was wondering if there are ways that we could bridge those silos or break down those silos because I think the separation is contributing to either the focus on one type of violence and not another type of violence. So are there ways that we can maybe bring these fields together?
Yeah, so I think that's really important as an academic community to sort of come together and exchange and do exactly what you're doing today. You are issues and topic based, not within a discipline. Yeah, and I think that's really important. What is generally not helpful, and some subjects are probably worse than some others. If you want to get tenure, so I've got tenure, so I feel free, liberated to don't have to chase particular journal publications. But so in some subjects, for example, in economics, methods matter an awful lot, and sometimes methods matter more than the issues. And I think I'd really like to push that, because often I attend presentations where a lot of very fancy statistics, and I'm all for it. Yeah, I'm one of those people who like numbers, as you could see. But, very often they look where they've got data and the methods, but not where the interesting and pertinent issues are. And I wish, some of the journals, and when we do journal reviews and so on, would be a bit braver and sort of say, yeah, this is all fine and good, but it actually only looks, at a very too small a sliver of the issue.
Thank you. We have a question from Wanjiku Kagira. In ICC-T training, how have you incorporated the local culture in the training to try to avoid imposing Western culture?
So this is a very important and thorny question. Thank you. So how children should be disciplined and what is considered as appropriate in every society is different. Yeah, and every one of us listening today would sort of see appropriate disciplining somewhere different. Yeah, but each society has got a point where they say this is abusive, yeah, and you shouldn't do this. Yeah, so caning a child aged 4.5 in a preschool so that they need medical attention is not something that any society will sort of condone. Yeah, and then you sort of go backwards and sort of say, okay, but what about a smack? What about this? What about that? And so certainly every society has it slightly differently somewhere, but there is plenty of evidence from different countries that even what we call smacking or slapping sort of is very detrimental to children. So how do we know this? When this is the norm, yeah? When this is the norm, maybe it's not so bad for children. I get hit, you get hit, everybody else in class gets hit. These clinical psychologists that I work with, for example, they take a lot of biomarkers. And so the cortisol level, so the stress hormone that helps you to survive in really dangerous situations. So the cortisol, so this is not per se a bad thing, but the cortisol levels in these children are higher. and this is irrespective of whether the whole class gets hit or not, there are certain physiological processes that are underway, no matter which child. We're all humans, yeah, no matter where this child is in school. And so, but maybe that wasn't your question. Maybe your question was more about, sort of how culturally sensitive should this program be. So I'm very much in favor of developing and offering programs that can work anywhere. So my medical analogy would be aspirin helps you with a fever no matter where you are. And so, of course, these social phenomena are more complicated, but my idea would be, look, if you want to do country X, you've got a problem with violence in schools. Here's a program tried and tested in many different countries, yeah, in Africa and Haiti. We're now going to Pakistan, we're in Turkey, West Africa is now also part of it. So it's a multi-site study we're in the process of building up. And it really helps teachers in many different situations to educate without the use of violence, and the children have a better learning outcome. So what's not to like? There's within the program, there's so day 2 is entirely focused on the particular experience that the teachers there have, because these sort of modes of use of violence and own experiences of violence is very personal and culturally specific. So yes, in that sense, the program is very adaptable, because the method of punishment that I showed you with this Haitian girl is maybe something that will be completely alien to lots of other cultures. So it's not prescriptive in that sense. It's sort of, you tell us, what the humiliating and degrading treatment that you've received as a child, what that was. Yeah. Well, we don't even, these are psychologists, they ask this much better than I just said, it's less directive. But they must be, so the trick here is to adapt it, to have enough space for local experiences, but to have an off-the-shelf technology that you can adapt really quickly. Sorry, this was a long answer, but it's to do with, culturally, what do we think we can do to children, and then also my idea of having a sort of generic method of sort of addressing the problem.
No, thank you. That was really helpful. So we have another question from Jonathan Gamble. It's a specific one about the pie chart diagram, and what was the largest segment, the 47%?
Sorry, I've got Zoom issues here. So, this was intimate partner violence was the largest percentage here, because it's 12% of all women experience this, and it's about 16% of children who experience violence from their parents. But there's, of course, more women than children. This is sort of how you can sort of think about it. And then also the costs are slightly higher for women, because there's a mix of physical and sexual assault. And as you could see, sexual assault is typically priced as higher by anybody who sort of looks into costs of violence, because the consequences of sexual assault can be absolutely enormous, and are often a lifelong, psychologically, but also physically. I mean, if you think of really really bad cases of rape, they can result in fistula, which is which then leads to incontinence, double incontinence, and lifelong problems for women. Of course, not every rape results in this, but there are sort of many physical and also the pregnancy that might result, the abortion that might result in this, the sexual transmitted diseases. So all of these sort of are much higher. So the highest rate of intimate partner violence is amongst young couples, and so they're this sort of and so the fertility choices are then also taken from the woman, and as I said, the sort of this sense of helplessness, and then also being tied to this man through the children is obviously a very difficult connection to break. Thank you.
Yes, it has. I'd like to ask this question. It has to do with this 47% of interpersonal violence, which you listed things like homicide, physical assault, sexual assault and rape, interpartner violence, violence against children, elderly, disabled, and that it occurs in the poorest countries, meaning at a higher percentage. What is disturbing to me is again the treatment of women throughout the world, and and in recent years there have been horrific crimes that have been committed against women, and I just wonder if there is, do you have in your research, are there other explanations for this? Because one of the things that the Baha'i chair is so interested in is actually how do we achieve full equality for women, because we think this is a very important aspect of creating more peaceful societies, for women to be much more, instead of subjects, they become agents and make decisions at all levels in society. So I'm just wondering, in the amazing research that you do, how do you think people or different organizations or academics are beginning to address this very, really disturbing issue regarding the treatment of women around the world?
So, like you, I'm disturbed by it and see the numbers clearly in front of me here. But I'm no gender expert. So exactly what Kate's first question was about, I'm trying to build a sort of interdisciplinary group here, and I've got a gender expert, and sort of talking with her about feminist theories and sort of how the patriarchy sorry, I need to turn this off. So how the patriarchy is responsible for this. And also I point very strongly to poorer countries. But it was only in 1996, so, when I was already a fully grown up woman, that Germany made rape within marriage a criminal offense. So it's not that long ago, and it took the women's lib movement in Germany 2.5 decades to sort of criminalize this. And so I think the sort of changing attitudes and sort of saying, okay, so maybe I'm just the starting point, and a talk like this is a starting point to sort of say this is really bad for quite a lot of women around the world. And now comes the sort of and why, because when I sort of thought, okay, with this research grant I've got from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, what do I do? Now, intimate partner violence is a huge problem, but it is a very difficult problem to address. I know that in the United States you've got a lot of very interesting programs. So from dating violence programs to sort of go into schools and to tell children about, or teenagers, 15, 14-year-old boys and girls, what respectful relationships are about. and these programs are hugely effective, yeah, when you see the numbers, when you follow them. And again, you know, for research, it's not just about now in the next 18 months, but also in 5 years, and hardly anybody gets a grant for 5 years. Yeah, we need to sort of have enough funding to then really look into, you know, what's happened. So, and then also healthcare providers in the United States provide a safe space where women can talk to their healthcare providers, just between us, I think it is. And then you've got these sort of adverts against violence in during football matches, I think you get. So it's a very interesting, very many interesting concepts, but we aren't there yet in quite a lot of other societies. But I think this sort of infotainment to sort of weave stories into some soap operas has been very successful in quite a few countries to make people talk and think about it. And is this something you experience? Oh, I've had this, you know, Me Too has been a global movement. So I think we're sort of getting there in the conversation. And then there are, of course, gender experts who are thinking about the sort of more structural causes behind this inequality.
Thank you so much. Another question, you gave Kenya as an example where child violence is among the highest. How reliable is the data used, taking into consideration that every few cases are reported unless it is severe? And again, culture plays a major role in determining what is abusive.
Yes, so as I said before, it is culturally sort of, there's a different understanding of what is permissible. Also within the United States, not every state has got the same laws and rules about it, for example. So maybe, so first of all, Kenya isn't particularly bad. It is a low middle income country, and and we do know from these demographic and health surveys and from the mix. So this isn't reports, this is people answering surveys, yeah, about what happens in their home. And these questions are asked to thousands of people across many different countries. And this is sort of how we can compare, yeah. And Kenya is by no means an outlier here, but many children do receive these sort of, or maybe I was talking about Kenya because I know the country fairly well. And I've got a very good research collaborator in Kisumu in Western Kenya, and we've got a joint project there. And when we were asking, so at the baseline, we ask mothers mainly how they discipline their children. It was terrifying to hear that some of them beat their relatively young children several times a day with a stick, yeah. This isn't a smack on the bottom or on the back of the legs. And I do agree with you, there's a sort of difference between this. I'd rather not have any of this. But I can sort of see that some parents will find smacking or slapping appropriate. And as I said, in the United States, not every state outlaws this punishment. Also in the United Kingdom, you're allowed to slap your child, or smacking as the British call it, if you don't leave a mark. Yeah, so there's different understanding, you're quite right, of what constitutes violence against children. I just wanted to make clear, I wanted to sort of, I'm against any of these physical disciplining methods, but because I'm aware of this, I only look at the severe forms of physical punishment, not the smacking. Yeah, even though I do think that shouldn't be done.
Thank you so much. I just want to read a comment from Jonathan Gamble. Thank you, very informative and invaluable data. And I think our last question is going to be asked by Kate Seaman.
Thank you, Hoda. So you had also flagged that it's generally young males that are involved in this interpersonal violence, or homicides and things like that. And I'm wondering, so in the US, you said that the kind of trend has changed. It started to increase again, and there are places where it's just been constantly increasing. So are there places where it has kind of continued a downward trend? And what have been the successful interventions that have occurred, or have there been structural changes? Kind of like, what are the lessons we can learn from the positive outcomes rather than the negative outcomes?
So you leave the easy question last, so I don't think this can be answered completely, because there's a big literature on this. So what caused this sort of fall over the last 3 decades in the Western world and in homicide rates? I can't tell you about the last 3 decades in Uganda or any of the other low-income countries, because we just haven't got the time series data. And then in the United States, well, you take your literature pick. Is it because abortion was legalized in the early 70s, as some people sort of say, and then you had fewer criminals, you know, available in the early 1990s? I don't think this is the case. I think this is not convincing argument. Is it because you've got less lead in the petrol and people have got you know, are less aggressive? I mean, honestly, you take your pick here. You know, what is it? A change in police numbers? Is it a change in police funding? Is it a change in the drugs, in the supply of drugs and the kind of drugs that people can use? I think it's much more on the latter. I think drugs have got a lot to answer for. And this isn't just the narco trafficking through Latin America over the Mexican-US border, but it's also intoxication with alcohol. So when you control alcohol consumption, you have much lower homicide rates. How do I know this? One last example, which might stick in your mind. Gorbachev wanted to reduce vodka drinking for a variety of reasons. Yeah, Russians weren't going to work and so on, and he stopped vodka. He reduced vodka consumption substantively, and the homicide rates dropped. You can clearly see this in the data. Yeah, so a sensible use of substances and a controlling of substances really helps with violence.
Thank you so much, Professor. Very, very interesting research, and the interdisciplinary aspect is also so rich. And I'm so glad that we have recorded today's program so that people can watch this wonderful presentation and you know, be able to see your very helpful tables and figures and all of that. We really appreciate your taking the time to be with us today. And I'd like to tell our viewers that we will now take a break on Eastern time from 10:30 to 10:45. And we will return at 10:45 to hear our next speaker, Professor Kate Pickett, who will speak about how more equal societies reduce stress, restore sanity, and improve everyone's well-being. Obviously, that will build upon what Professor Hoeffler has so beautifully outlined for us this morning. Thank you again. We'll see you in a little bit. Bye-bye.
Thank you for having me. Bye for now.
Bye.